Logic gives you everything you need to get a professional vocal sound. The secret is not in some fancy tricks that you see on YouTube, it's in how well you're applying the fundamentals of what you already have inside Logic. And that's what I want to show you in this video series. Over the next few videos, we're going to go through everything you need to know to get a professional sounding vocal inside Logic with just the stock tools. But let's fast forward and listen to a before and after of the vocal that we'll be mixing so you can decide if this video series is even for you, if I'm someone you want to learn from. Quick caveat with that, this is a specific genre, specific sound, but these same vocal principles apply to any genre, any sound, no matter what you're working on. I've used these same mixing techniques on everything from folk to country to rap, and in this case we're listening to it on kind of an indie rock song. So keep that caveat in mind. If you like the overall transformation, that's what we're looking at, that's what we're talking about. So let's go and check out that before and after.
Every time say that we both agree that we've got an understanding, except that look when you leave. So for weeks we can be so discreet until your life gets too demanding. Now we're breaking the heat. I've been down, but I've never been down like this. And it's something out of nothing, now it's something I miss. Something that I miss. I've been down, but I've never been down like this. Laid out at home, thinking about that kiss. It was just one kiss.
So if that sounds good to you, let's go and jump into Logic and kick off this series. But first, I want to give you something. In addition to this series, I've also taken all of these 6 steps and put them into a downloadable guide that you can just quickly reference back to anytime you're mixing vocals in the future. That way you don't have to keep coming back to these videos. It's completely free from the link in the description below, so be sure to pick it up. Let's go and jump into Logic. So we're going to start with step 1, which is tuning and timing. Now, I typically don't think of tuning and timing as part of the mixing process. It's more a mix prep or editing process that I do before I start mixing. But I'm including it in this series because I think the number one telltale sign of an amateur mix, an amateur production, is the timing and tuning being a little bit off. It can be a great mix, fundamentally, technically speaking, but if the vocals are just a little bit out of time or they're just a little bit out of tune in a way that's too obvious, and I'm not talking about intentional or like where it's the right vibe, where it's kind of dragging or whatever. I'm talking about when it's just wrong. That's something that has to be fixed and can be fixed very easily, very simply inside Logic. Now, we're going to be using flex pitch for this. This is functionally going to be a flex pitch tutorial, but as opposed to other flex pitch tutorials that you may or may not have seen, where they're basically doing really big moves, it's really transforming the sound of the vocal, this is kind of going to be the opposite of that. This is going to be about how little can you do and how natural can it sound, and how minute details should you really be paying attention to get professional sounding results. So let's go and listen to what we have here. This is the song One Look by Broke Royals, same song as you heard in the intro. And this song was completely recorded, mixed, and mastered in home studios. These vocals were done in home studio. And our focus is going to be on the lead vocal and then the main left and right doubles that are trying to be as close to the lead vocal as possible. Now, we recorded multiple passes, comped together one lead vocal take, and then we recorded the doubles to that. So we tried to match them as close as we could in the recording phase. But now in the editing phase that we're technically in right now, we're going to try to tighten them up just a little bit with a little bit of vocal tuning and a little bit of timing using flex pitch. So let's go and listen to it in the context of the song, and then I'll solo it as well.
I've been down, but I've never been down like this. And it's something out of nothing, now it's something I miss. Something that I miss. I've been down, but I've never been down like this. Laid out at home, thinking about that kiss. It was just one kiss.
In the context, you might not pick up on all the little things, but as you start to process them and bring them forward in the mix, you'll just start to be pulled. You may have noticed there's little moments where the ears are slightly different pitch than the center vocal. There's moments where the timing is just a little bit off, so you might get pulled off to one ear or the other. With doubles in general, you want to get them as tight as you can to lead vocals, so they kind of just reinforce the lead vocal and disappear into the mix. So let's go and pull up flex time here on this lead vocal. I'm hitting E on my keyboard to bring up the editor window. And we just want to toggle on flex right here and then switch this to flex pitch. Now what you're seeing with flex pitch is all the individual notes that were sung. So it breaks it out for you automatically and you have full control over each individual note. You can really fine tune it to hit exactly where you intended for it to. Now with each of these, they break out the note for you. And if you want to break it out, if you think it's actually meant to be 2 notes instead of 1, like let's say this was supposed to be 2 notes, you could select your scissor tool here and split it into 2 notes and then treat them separately. But with each note that you have 6 points. So the top left is a pitch drift, or the drift into the note. The top right is a pitch drift out of the note. The center is the fine pitch, which is your cents. So not even semitones, but even smaller fraction of that. Again, to really fine tune it. And then the bottom left is gain. So the volume for that individual note or word or phrase. The center is vibrato. So essentially how extreme or how minor the vibrato is. This can start to be very obvious, so do be careful with adjusting the vibrato, but it can definitely get you out of a pinch if it was a little bit too much. And then the bottom right is formant, and this is more for like changing the overall tone. This is kind of more of an effect in my opinion experience. So if you listen here, I've formant shifted this entire phrase.
I've been down, but I never been down like this, laid out.
It's pretty cool, but I don't think I'd ever use that in just a standard tuning scenario. Okay, and then the last thing is over here, the scale quantize. I highly recommend you set this to the key of your song. So in this case, we're in A minor. That way it will snap the notes to the notes in the key of the song and not ever put them out of the key of the song. Kind of helpful. Okay, now with this, the first and foremost thing that you need to do anytime you're tuning vocals is listen in the context of the mix and determine if it even needs to be tuned. If you're totally happy with how it sounds, it's okay if it looks a little weird. That said, you can also look at it to try to determine, okay, I thought it sounded a little weird, but I wasn't sure what was going on. So in this case, I know that she shouldn't really be hitting this D sharp, E flat. She should be all the way up on this E. Let's listen in the context of the mix and see if we hear that as well.
I've been down, but I never been down like this, laid out at home, thinking about that piece.
I think, yeah, just a little bit flat. So I'm going to try to bring her up a little bit. Let's listen to it in solo. We're just going to select all of these notes that should have been up on that E. And if you double tap on them, it will put them to the nearest note. Now, here's a perfect example. It's putting them onto that note that she shouldn't be on. So I'm going to grab these and pull them up to that E. And now let's listen to it.
I've been down, but I never been down like this, laid out.
That's a lot better. Let's keep going. So here, let's listen to this phrase.
Laid out at home, think.
I actually think I like that, the way she's swelling up into it. Even though it's technically maybe wrong, I like the feel of it. Never like worry about it being too correct as long as it feels right to you. So I'm okay with how that feels. And then these, I think I could just pull down just a little bit, get them closer to that note. Let's listen to how this sounds.
Home, thinking about that kiss.
Let's listen in the context of the mix.
Home, thinking about that kiss.
I'm also going to shift this one up just a little bit. That sounds good to me. Now, there's one thing I want to point out when we're listening in solo, and it's kind of this artifacty thing that I hear a little bit on S's, specifically with flex pitch. Notice it with this S here.
Thinking about that kiss.
It's not massive. It just sounds a little bit processed. Over time, I found it on more and more vocals. So on my lead vocal, I've recently started using Melodyne by Salamoni. I'll link to it down below. And I think that just doesn't have the same kind of artifactiness on the S's. That said, I've released plenty of songs that I tuned with flex pitch, and I still use flex pitch for all my backing vocals because it's much easier to really dial things in with it. Okay, let's go ahead, now that we've tuned that main line, let's go ahead and look at how we would adjust the tuning and timing of the double to that lead line. Now, quick note, you can also adjust the timing within flex pitch. So if you really wanted this line to be right there, like you really wanted to make sure that she hit this exact phrase right on this bar right here,
Out at home, thinking about that kiss.
which is technically right and totally fine to adjust, then you could make that adjustment right here in flex pitch. In my case, I've already kind of timed up her entire lead vocal. So what we're going to do instead is use flex pitch to adjust the timing and the tuning of the double to that lead vocal and use the lead vocal as the guide, making sure that the double hits exactly where the lead vocal is. So let's go ahead and go down to our left vocal here. We'll go ahead and switch up to flex pitch. And right off the bat, I'm pretty sure, yeah, our lead vocal comes in right on that E, whereas this left ear is gliding up into it. So let's go and pull this left ear so it starts right on that E. And let's go and pull all these notes up to that E as well. And see, again, double tapping and puts them to the nearest note, but now I need to pull it to the nearest note in the key. And let's pull up these just a little bit too, because I know these were on that D. Don't say anything in the comments.
I've been down, but I never been down like this, laid.
So it starts to get a little weird at the end, right around here. If we look at our lead vocal by selecting our lead vocal track, you can see we're up on that D, whereas this vocal is, yeah, just a little bit flat. So we're going to pull that up and pull this up as well. Let's look at where it's landing. Yeah, that's pretty much all the way up on the D.
Down like this, laid out a hole.
This should be better.
Coming down like this, laid.
A little bit flat, and actually, I think timing-wise, we might need to adjust this just a little bit. So just listen through, make the adjustments to get things tighter, but also listen for anything that grabs your ear as just being a little bit off. So yeah, this one is a semitone low, so we're going to shift that up.
Like this, laid out.
And then I think that this is a little bit late, and I think it's a little bit flat. We're probably on the E on the lead vocal. Let's look on the lead vocal. Yeah, it's up on that E. So I'm just going to drag this up to the E. And I'm also, if you see my cursor is set at the start of this word on this vocal, on the lead vocal, and I'm later with this. So I'm going to drag this back.
Down like this, laid out at home, thinking about that kiss.
So mostly okay through that second half of the phrase, but there starts to be a little bit of pitch stuff.
Laid out at home, thinking about
that home. We can see the lead vocal here starts right around there. Ours is a little bit later. So I want to go down to the lead vocal, or the double here, and shift it just a little bit back. And then also double check pitches. Yeah, we want to have both of those right on the D. Let's listen to that.
Home, out at home, thinking about that kiss.
A little bit with that, about that. What's going on with this second word here? Yeah, so this needs to be, so I'm going to split this with the scissors, and then I'm going to pull this up. And then I think, yeah, this last word here is a little bit early, so we're just going to shift that a little bit late, so now those timings are perfectly aligned. And then this word here needs to shift back just a little bit and come up a semitone. All right, let's listen to that.
Out at home, thinking about that kiss. It was just.
And that sounds good to me. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and do that same exact thing with the right ear, and then I'm going to play a before and after for you. And notice how before there's a lot of little things that pull your ear, and after it just sounds like one consistent vocal that's really full across the center, left and right.
All those lies I told myself, or the eyes of someone else. No, they never really held. All those lies I told myself, or the eyes of someone else. No, they never really held. I've been down, but I never been down like this. Laid out at home, thinking about that kiss. I've been down, but I never been down like this. Laid out at home, thinking about that kiss.
So it's a subtle difference, but this is the kind of thing that gets you from an amateur mix up to a professional mix. It's all these little subtle improvements in the recording phase, in the editing phase, in the mixing phase that lead up to having a professional sounding final result. Okay, let's go and move on to step 2, which is EQ. EQ is the first tool that you need to learn if you want to get a professional vocal mix, but unfortunately, I can't just give you an EQ preset that's going to make every vocal and every song sound professional. If I could, I'd be the most famous YouTuber in the music production space. There's just too much variability in the human voice, in the microphone, in the sound of the microphone in the room, in the song, in the key of the song, that all impact what EQ moves need to be made. But what I can give you is just 5 simple vocal EQ zones, and all you need to do is determine at each zone if and how much you want to boost or cut. That's it. Makes vocal EQ much, much simpler. Now, if you don't want to take notes or write these down or come back to this video in the future, I've also put them into a downloadable guide that's completely free that also has the other 5 steps to a professional vocal mix. It's completely free from the link in the description below, so be sure to pick it up. But let's go and jump into Logic. And by the way, stick around till the end and I'll show you a little trick to get a really high fidelity vocal sound if that's what you're looking for. Okay, so the first zone that you need to pay attention to is the rumble zone. Sounds ridiculous, but this is where there's just going to be rumble in the vocal. So down here from 20 hertz up to 150 hertz on the high end is just rumble. Check it out on this vocal here.
Every time say
See that down there? If I really exaggerate it.
That we've got an understanding, except that look when you leave.
It's just like woof, woof, woof sound from the air from her vocal. It's not really adding anything to this vocal, and it's just going to get in the way of other things that need that space. So the first and only EQ move that I do on every vocal is a high pass filter, cutting up until I start to impact the sound of the vocal and then scaling it back a little bit. So on the high end, it's usually around 150 hertz. Sometimes it's lower if it's a really low pitched voice, but on this vocal, I think I can get a little bit higher. But listen to it as I start to get too high and how it starts to cut into the vocal a little bit.
Every time say that we both agree.
So it's really thinned it out. It's a cool sound, but not what I'm going for in this mix. So somewhere around here sounds like it's still letting it all cut through. So I think around 160 hertz feels like the right place for me for this high pass filter. Okay, the second zone is the body zone. This is where you get fullness out of your vocal. And some vocals, depending on how they were recorded, need a little bit of a boost in this area. Some actually need to be cut a little bit in this area. If it feels like it's way too muddy, way too full, then you might want to cut here. When there's too much of it, it sounds something like this.
Every time say that we both agree.
And when there's not enough, it sounds something like this. So I actually think on this vocal, I like the feel of it as it currently is in terms of the body. It feels very full, but it's not overpowering. So I'm going to leave it at least for now. Now, the third zone is where we start to get into boxy and muddy frequencies. And this is anywhere from 200 hertz up to about 800 hertz. So if we have too much in this zone, it sounds something like this.
Every time say that we both agree.
It's kind of cheap. If we have way too little, then it sounds something like this.
Every time say that we
Again,
both
thin.
agree.
If you move it a little bit higher, it starts to feel a little scooped, a little bit unnatural. But if we listen to this vocal here,
every time say that we both agree.
It does have a little bit of that cheap, boxy sound. So I do want to cut a little bit of that. So what we want to do is between 200 and 800 hertz, just sweep and find where it sounds the worst and then do a bit of a cut.
Every time say that we both agree.
So to
that
me,
we've got an understanding,
right around 600 hertz. So I'm going to
leave.
cut right around there, maybe make it a little bit narrower.
Every time say that we both agree. That
And
we've
if I
got
add that back
an
in,
understanding,
a little cheaper,
that look when you leave.
a little bit cleaner. So this is probably the number one place that I think I notice in amateur mixes, their vocals just feeling really amateur is too much in this 200 to 800 hertz range. So be sure to pay attention here. Too little, it starts to sound too thin, but too much and it sounds really, really cheap, especially in the like 4 to 800 range in particular. That's where it's really, really boxy. Okay, the next area is the presence range, and this is from 1K up to about 4K. Now, too much of this is going to sound kind of harsh and fatiguing, something like this.
Every time say that we both agree.
A little bit telephony. Too little is going to sound like this.
Every time say that
it's hard to make out what
both
she's saying.
agree.
This is where we get the intelligibility of the vocal, so where we can make out what the vocalist is actually saying. So we want to have a good amount of this. This is also where it's going to cut through in the mix in most cases. So let's go ahead and put that back up to where it was. And if you're going to do a boost in this area, which I think this vocal could use, do it in the context of the mix. Listen, boosting around and sweeping in the context of the mix for where it sounds best with everything else. So that's what we're going to do here. Let's go and listen with the song.
Every time say that we both agree. That we've got an understanding, except that look when you leave.
So I think there's kind of two cool areas in this range. The first is around 1.5. So I'm going to do a boost around here.
Every time say that we both agree.
Around there.
That we've got an understanding,
A little bit smaller,
that
a
look
little bit
when you
narrower.
leave. Every
And let's go and do the same thing right around 3K. Let's go and make this narrower.
Every time say that we both agree. That we've got an understanding, except that look when you leave.
Now, with EQ, each of these is a volume boost at those specific frequencies. So you need to pay attention. If you're doing a lot of boosts, you're going to be adding a little bit of volume. And then when you check if you like what you're doing with your EQ by turning it off and on, you might just like it better because you've actually made it louder. So you also want to turn it down on your output gain over here if you're doing too many boosts. If you're doing too many cuts, you might actually need to add a little bit of volume. But here we just want to turn it down just a little bit to make sure that we're offsetting these boosts that we're doing. So without these EQ moves, it sounds like this.
Every time say that we both agree.
And with them, it sounds like
that
this.
we've got an understanding. understand.
Much clearer, much more present, but there's still one more EQ zone that you should pay attention to, and that's from 8K and above. This is the air frequency range. This is where you get a really high fidelity sound. Now, this isn't the trick that I'm going to show you. Stick around for that. That's in just a minute, but this is anywhere from 8K and above. But really quickly, if you're liking this video so far and you think it would be helpful to someone else, could you be sure to like it? It's really helpful to the YouTube algorithm just to know that it's actually helpful to people, so be sure to like it. Let's go and get back into it. So anywhere here, 8K and above, if I boost it really extreme, it sounds like this.
Every time, say that we both agree.
A little bit too much. It's kind of thin, kind of papery, but you really hear the air in the vocal. So this can be really, really nice if you want your vocal to just sound really upfront, close, and present. Now, with a pop song, this is very, very important. With a kind of alt-rock song like this, it's a little 50-50, but with this vocal, I really want to have it sounding a little bit airy. So
every time,
let's find in the context of the mix where it feels good.
That we've got an understanding, except that look when you leave.
Around 9K sounds good to me, so I'll dive it back a little bit.
Every time, say that we both agree. That we've got an understanding.
So that sounds good to me. Now, real quick side note, if you want to have kind of a more lo-fi sound, cutting out up here can sound really good if you listen to that in solo.
Every time,
because it's kind of that lo-fi sound, but I like it with that extra air, so we'll go ahead and put it back and it sounds like
every
this.
time, say that we both agree.
Okay, now for that high fidelity trick, in Logic, I love to use their Vintage Tube EQ under the Vintage EQ collection. This is really, really great. Just has a very musical high end. So with this EQ, it may look confusing, but all you need to know is that this knob right here is how much you're boosting in the high frequencies, and this knob right here is the exact frequency that it's boosting. And then the bandwidth here, I encourage you to set somewhere between 5 and higher. Basically, it's just going to be how wide is that EQ move. With these really high fidelity moves, I find wider just sounds a little bit better. So what I like to do is set it around 8K, and then just boost really extreme, and then find the frequency, and then dial it back and mix it up until I'm noticing it and it feels right in the context of the song. So let's listen to it and find the frequency.
Every time, say that we both agree. That we've got an understanding, except that look when you leave.
I think around 11K sounds good to me on here.
Say that we
So we'll take it all the way out.
That we've got an understanding, except that look when you leave. Every time.
Okay, and that's working for me, and I'm just going to scale the output volume down just a little bit. And then let's listen to this vocal with and without the CQ.
Every time, say
So
that
without.
we both agree. That we've
And
got an understanding, except that look when you leave.
Huge improvement, right? Now, real quick, let's just look at how I've set it on this backing vocal here. So here, as a backing vocal, I don't want it to cut through quite as much, so I'm not doing any sort of presence boosting, any sort of air. I'm just cutting out some of the stuff that was making it feel a little bit too full, a little bit too muddy. I want it to be a thinner backing vocal. So sometimes I might even cut some of these high frequencies. Sometimes I might cut the high pass filter even higher. In this case, I felt like just cutting a little bit of that was the right move. Okay, so those are our 6 zones. We have the low rumble up to about 150 hertz. We have the body between 100 and 400 hertz. We have the muddy boxy frequencies between 200 and 800 hertz. We have the presence between 1K and 4K, and then we have the bright airy frequencies from 8K and above. Now again, if you don't have that Pro Vocal checklist, be sure to download it. It has all these frequencies listed out and the other 5 steps that we're doing in this series to create a Pro Vocal mix inside Logic. It's completely free, so be sure to grab it. But let's go and move on to step number 3, which is de-essing. One of the biggest things that separates a Pro Vocal mix from an amateur vocal mix is how well you address the harsh frequencies. These harsh frequencies are typically caused from sibilant sounds like S's and T's and shs and chs and all that stuff. And how well you address those can make a huge difference in how professional the final result sounds. So in today's video, we're going to go through Logic's built-in de-esser, which is the main tool that you use to address this, go through all the settings and really understand how to set one to address those harsh frequencies so that your vocal feels smooth while still being bright and airy. So you'll find the de-esser under Dynamics. It's called the de-esser 2. And it looks like this. Now, with this, there's 3 main knobs, and then 3 main options. And then we have 2 meters over here that we'll look at in just a second. Now, the first thing you need to know about a de-esser is that it's basically EQ and compression happening in one, but for the very specific purpose of de-essing your signal. I mean, what a ridiculous name, right? But think of it as like de-harshening your signal, or de-essing if you think that's funnier. I think it's funnier. Okay, so it's an EQ and compressor. So what you are functionally doing is you're setting a range that it's going to listen to where the S's or sh's or t's, the harsh frequencies, are most prominent. And then it is either going to compress just those frequencies or the entire signal every time it detects too much of those frequencies. So EQ and compression kind of slammed into one. Now, it's focused on the frequency range, the highest frequency range, typically 5K and above, but there's actually a case where I have found that it makes a really big difference in the vocal that's a little bit lower than that we're going to look at the end of this video. So let's go through these options really quick so you understand what all you're actually setting and how to set this for your vocal. So the first thing you need to know is this threshold. Now, a threshold, when a signal passes a threshold, it's going to tell it to turn it down. But what's amazing about this de-esser is that it has both absolute and relative mode. So it defaults to relative mode, and I'd say for 90% of vocals, that's what you want, because what that means is that whether it's a quiet signal or a loud signal, it's going to detect the threshold relative to the total signal. So if it's a quiet word, but that S peaks up really extreme relative to that quiet word, it will still catch it. If it's a loud word and, maybe it's louder in general, but that S, it's not actually hitting S's, it won't be catching those. And then when one does peak up, it will catch it relative to that louder word volume. So it's a more modern feature. It's pretty amazing. Classic de-essers did not have this. They were more of the absolute style. So I don't think I'd ever actually change this to absolute. I'd keep it on relative. Okay, and then the max reduction is how much it's going to turn down. So the threshold determines if it is an S that needs to be turned down, or I'll say S anytime I'm referring to these sibilant frequencies. So does it need to be turned down is determined by the threshold. When it passes the threshold, will it turn it down? And then the max reduction is what amount is the most it will let it go down. So it will pass it by this much, but you say, I'm only going to let it turn it down this much. Or do you want to say, I'm going to let it really slam it down 25 decibels, which is a lot. So you have the range here of 25 all the way up to 0 decibels. So you could have very subtle, very light de-essing, or very aggressive de-essing if you happen to have really harsh S's. And then your frequency is just the frequency that it's listening to. Now, there's 2 different filters that it can be listening to. It can be listening to a bell, a notch, so kind of just like a specific band of frequencies, or it can be listening to the entire high shelf, so from here all the way up. I think that's reversed on your signal, so it probably looks this way on an EQ. But what we're talking about is basically this highest area up here all the way up. So either a notch or the whole shelf all the way up. And it defaults to being that shelf, but in some cases you might actually want it to be a notch. We'll look at that again in a minute, but we'll keep it on the shelf for now. And then the filter solo allows us to just listen to just the frequencies that we're hearing right here. And then split versus wideband. The split is either only going to turn down this filtered range, or it's going to turn down, if you set it to wide, the entire signal. Wide being the wide frequency spectrum versus split, just that split off frequency range. In most cases, I find split to sound a little bit more natural. It's only turning down just the S's or just the frequencies that are harsh. But on some vocals, if it's really aggressive, I found that wide can sound a little bit better. But most of the time, I would keep this on split. So keep mode on relative, range on split for most vocals. But if you're really struggling to dial it in, try wide and just see if that sounds a little bit better. Okay, let's listen to what this sounds like. So I have filter solo on, so it's only going to be hearing what I've set in terms of my frequency and this high shelf here. So we're just hearing 7K and up. If I switch it to the notch filter, it gets a little bit on both sides of 7K. So as I bring it down, now we're getting down into kind of the main presence area of the vocal. Up here is more the harsher SC area. So listening to your frequencies and solos can help you identify, but don't get lost in solo. You just want to use this to check if that's really catching everything that you feel like you're hearing. Now, real quick, if this video is helpful and you think it would help other people, could you be sure to like it? It makes a huge difference in terms of YouTube knowing to show it to other people. So if it's helpful, you think it would help someone else, be sure to like it. And if you really don't like it, be sure to hit the dislike twice. Okay, let's get back into it. Another way that you can determine what frequency to set this to is by watching your EQ while they're singing, and when an S spikes up, you'll see it up here. What frequency range is that really spiking up?
So for weeks we can be so discreet.
So it looks like for her, she's somewhere around 6 to 8K, this range up here.
So for we
Probably with the harshest around 9, but I do want to catch down around 6. So I'm going to keep this set to 6, which is actually the default. If I hold Option and click on it, it just goes to 6. It comes up on 7K, which is fine too, but we'll put this back to 6K, which seems like a good option for her voice. And then what you want to be looking for with this threshold to adjust it is just, is this detection meter over here only really spiking, as in turning yellow, when she's hitting S's or sh's or other harsh sounds. Sometimes you might have a k or a t or some of those sounds that have those harsh frequencies as well, but is it only doing it when you're hearing things that are harsh?
So for weeks we can be so discreet until your life gets too demanding. Now we're breaking the heat.
Pretty good, right? That heat must have a little bit of something, but you said the t got caught in there as well, but mostly it's just catching the S's and those sibilant sounds. So this default negative 9.5 is pretty good because remember it's relative. So it's listening to whatever the total volume for that little section of the word being sung is and setting that to be 9.5 relative. So I find this to be a pretty good setting point for most cases, unless I want to be more aggressive. If you want to have more aggression than this is giving you, you can bring this down, and then the max reduction can be extended because it's going to compress relative on how much it passes that threshold. So as the signal passes that threshold, if it gets way past it, it's going to compress it more, and then you have more that you can play with your max reduction. But the thing you got to be careful of is starting to capture more than you want. So if I bring this all the way down,
so for weeks,
the entire vocal is now being detected, right? So I don't want that to be happening. I just want
breaking the heat.
Just those harshest frequencies to be captured.
So for weeks we can be so discreet.
So I think on this vocal, even around 15, negative 15, that's pretty good. But I'm now starting to get more on my max reduction meter, which is just an important thing to realize, is now it's compressing it more. It's de-essing it more because more is passing that threshold. Okay, so we can leave this at negative 15.5 because it's still only catching the things we want. The big thing that you need to be paying attention to set this properly for your vocal is the max reduction. So now that we know it's only detecting the S's and it's basically giving us as much range as I want to turn it down, and we only are listening and turning it down at this frequency. And actually, that's a good reminder. I actually think on this vocal, I probably wanted to capture here and everything up. So let's switch between these and notice if you notice a difference.
So for weeks, we
this is on the
can be
filter
so discreet
versus the shelf.
So for weeks, we can be so discreet until your life gets too demanding. Now we're breaking the
So the shelf feels a little bit more obvious to me.
So for weeks we can
versus the filter.
So for weeks we can
But I feel like there's still some sounds that are passing through with this notch, probably actually higher than where the top of this filter is catching, this bell is catching. So again, this is 6K right in the middle of this, so it's getting a little bit below and a little bit above, but then there's going to probably be some way up higher. So I think this is better, but I just need to play around more with the max reduction because it's a little bit too obvious now.
So for weeks
that's very obvious compared to
So for weeks we
still hearing some of those S's, but I'm just being tricked because it really just means I don't have full control over those S's. So what I'd rather do is have it really containing them too much and then set my max reduction so that I'm bringing the relative level of those harsh sounds, those harsh S's and whatnot, down relative to the lead vocal. Now, you can do this in solo, it's a good starting point, but also always check it in the context of the mix because there's high frequencies that could be kind of overshining the S's in your vocal mix. So you might actually need them to spike up more than you think you do in solo in the context of the full mix. So we'll do it in solo first, but just keep that in mind.
So for weeks we can be so
no de-essing,
until your life
bring
gets
the max
too
reduction down.
Now we're breaking the heat.
Let's do that one more
So
time.
for weeks we can be so discreet until your life gets too demanding.
Somewhere
now
in there.
We're breaking the heat.
Feels pretty good to me. So basically what I'm doing is I'm just listening for when it just starts to sound a little bit too much. If you go too much, it's going to sound you're creating a lisp to them. It's going to feel very artificial. But if you get it at the sweet spot, basically just right before you notice that. So if you start to hear that a lot around here,
so for weeks
then you just need to scale it back. So in my case, I started to notice it just feeling like a little bit too much containing on the S's right around, 8, 9. So I just scaled it back a little bit. So bring it down until you notice it too much and then scale it back a little bit. So
for weeks we can be so discreet until your life gets too demanding. Now we're breaking the heat.
that feels pretty good to me. Okay, let's listen to the context and see if we still feel like that's the right amount.
So for weeks we can be so discreet until your life gets too demanding. Now we're breaking the heat. So for weeks we can be so discreet until your life gets too demanding. Now we're breaking the heat.
So listening, I bypassed it off and back on. Felt like I just wanted a little bit more of those S's back, so I actually scaled the max reduction down just a little bit, or back just a little bit, so it's less extreme. Now, there is a case, I've over time figured out that there's this main range that's 5K and above, or 5K and above probably for you on the video, but there's also this little pocket right around 3.5K that on some vocals, the shs in particular, can just sound a little bit too harsh, and you might need to dip down a little bit around that 3.5K range. So it's become more and more common for me to set a second de-esser to address just that frequency range. So with this, I want to have it on this filter and this notch here as opposed to on the high shelf. And basically you just want to set it somewhere around 3.5K. I often listen in solo to find where I feel like those sh and shs stand out the most at this frequency range. And I'm just listening to this pocket here as opposed to the high shelf. So let's find that frequency first.
So for weeks we can be so discreet until your life gets too demanding. Now we're breaking the heat. So for weeks we
I feel like that's pretty good right around there.
So for weeks we
So right around 3.5. And now what I want to do is just set this to only really turn it down a little bit. I find that just a little bit, 3 to 5 decibels of turning it down will often
So
be
for
enough.
weeks we can be so discreet until your life gets too demanding. Now we're breaking the heat.
Okay, and in the context of the mix,
So for weeks we can be so discreet until your life gets too demanding. Now we're breaking the heat.
and listen to this, we'll do a before and after. So this is before,
So for weeks we can be so discreet until your life gets too demanding. Now we're breaking the heat.
and then with the de-esser.
So for weeks we can be so discreet until your life gets too demanding. Now we're breaking the heat.
Okay, so final note is on plugin order because it really matters where you put this de-esser in your chain, but there's no one right answer. So it's very common to put the de-esser very first and then do any sort of EQ moves after. A pretty common thing for me is that I'll actually do like a main EQ where I'm doing most of my basic EQ moves, but then I might have this tube EQ where I'm really just boosting the high end a little bit extra. And I'll want to do that after my de-essers. So I have the main EQ, then I have de-essers, then I have this tube EQ that's brightening it just a little extra, kind of making up for what I might have lost from the de-essers. And then a third place is after we set our compression, which we're going to do in the next video. After you set your compression, because S's tend to be quieter sounds but harsh in frequency, sometimes they get brought back out by compression. So I'll typically de-ess before compression, and then if I notice the compressor bringing those S's out too much again, I might just copy a second layer of them down after the compression. Addressing these frequencies is very, very important if you want your mix to sound professional. If you have harsh things in the vocal, the listener's not going to be able to enjoy the experience. It's going to be distracting, and it's going to make them not want to listen to it because it's harsh and it's fatiguing. So addressing this is really, really crucial. Okay, let's go move on to step number 4, compression. Compression is a crucial part of your vocal mix, but it doesn't have to be complicated. A lot of people make it seem way too confusing, way too complicated. It doesn't have to be. In today's video, we're going to look at 2 approaches to vocal compression that are emulated after some of the most famous vocal compressors in the world, just using this stock Logic compressor. It's amazing what you can do with this thing. So let's go and jump into Logic and take a look at this. Now, if you're not familiar with compression, the concept of compression, at least as we're going to be using it for vocals, is that we're going to contain the louder words, compress the louder words, and then use makeup gain to bring them back up to their original volume. And then the quieter words won't get compressed, so they will just benefit from that makeup gain and get brought up in volume. And now the difference between the loudest words and the quieter words is much smaller. For example, this word right here is a lot louder than this little word right here. So I want to get those a little closer together so that nothing is ever too loud and nothing is ever too quiet and gets lost in the mix. Now, that's the technical reason that we do it, but in terms of the feel of the vocal, what this really does is make the vocal feel really upfront, really present for the listener. So it's very crucial, even if you are just lightly containing the dynamics, the act of compression just helps bring that vocal forward. So you're going to want to do this on most, if not all, vocal mixes. And the first approach is definitely my main approach. So you'll find the compressor under Dynamics, Compressor. The first type that we're going to be looking at is an 1176 style compression. This is an incredibly fast compressor and it works really well on most vocals. The only vocals I don't do this on are really soft vocals that just need very gentle compression. This is a bit of an aggressive compression, but it works in a lot of different genres from rock to pop to rap. I would say I end up with this compressor for about 90% of my vocals. So you have two options in terms of the emulation up here. You have Studio FET or Vintage FET. They're both 1176 style, but the Studio FET is the one that I prefer. It's the one that I grab most of the time. This one's a little bit gentler sounding in my opinion. This one's a little bit more aggressive. And then the main settings that we would need to tweak is always turn off auto gain. That's the number one thing I do. For this style compression, we want to turn off the auto release function as well. And then we want to set our ratio to 4:1. That's the lowest setting of a ratio on a 1176 style compressor. The cool thing is you can cheat this. If you want to go lighter, less aggressive, you can. So you could turn your ratio down. If you want a more aggressive vocal that really cuts through, you could go a little bit more aggressive as well. But 4:1 is a good starting point and works on most vocals in my experience. And then the attack time. So in 1176, the slowest attack time is about 0.9 milliseconds. So I like to set my attack time to 1 millisecond. I find that the slowest setting on 1176 works really well for vocals to still have a little bit of punch. The words cut through a little bit. They get this kind of spittiness that really helps them sit in the mix. And 0.1 milliseconds is pretty good. And then your release time around 50 milliseconds. So that is the standard setting for an 1176. Now, another little thing that we can do to get more of that 1176 style sound is to turn on the soft distortion. This is basically just a little bit of saturation that's emulating the analog saturation that you would get if you were running through an analog piece of hardware. So a little bit of this is really nice. So I find soft works pretty well on vocals. There's some vocals this doesn't sound good on. So if you turn it on and you realize you don't like the sound of it, maybe try turning it back off. But I find that most vocals benefit and sound pretty good with this soft distortion on. Okay, so that is the initial settings. Now all we have to do is focus on our threshold here, dialing this in so I'm catching the loudest words, but not really the quietest words. And then using the makeup gain to balance the output volume so it's the same volume when the compressor's off and on, so I can assess whether or not I like the sound of this compression. Now real quick, instead of writing that all down, I put all of these settings in a guide that you can download below. It's my Pro Vocal checklist. It goes through all these settings as well as everything else we're covering in this Pro Vocal mixing series. So be sure to pick it up for free from the link in the description below. And if you're finding this video helpful and you think it'd be helpful to someone else, could you be sure to like the video to make sure more people see it? I just want to make sure that this video helps as many people as possible. Okay, let's go ahead and listen to it here.
And I'm running, and it's all I'm done with you. Every time, say that we both agree that we've got an understanding, except that look when you leave.
So what I'm looking for is that on the quietest words, or at least the quietest parts of the word, so at the tail end of a word, for example, we're getting little to no compression. So let's let it play through a little bit more, and you can kind of see what's happening on the waveform right here, and notice what's happening on the meter. Try to watch how they're interacting with the meter.
So for weeks we can be so discreet until your life gets too demanding. Now we're
And if we could have a little bit more compression. So I used to be really worried about the amount of compression not going over 4 or 5 decibels. A lot of people would really sell you on that. In my experience, it matters a little less. It's okay if it kind of gets extreme. And in some cases, you want it to be extreme. So you could be having it hit, 20 decibels on here, really aggressive compression. If we listen to an example of that, if we set this really aggressively and listen to it in solo.
So for weeks we can be so discreet.
It brings a little bit more of the room noise, but it gives you this very pumping sound to the vocal That's a cool effect, especially with rock music. With this vocal, I think it's not the right effect for us. So we're just going to aim for something a little more subtle here.
So for weeks we can be so discreet until your life gets too demanding. Now we're breaking the heat.
So you see how on heat it barely pops up. We're hitting maybe 1 decibel. And at the tail end and start of some of the words, we're getting little to no compression. That's what we're looking for on this meter.
So for weeks we can be so discreet until your life
And then we're
gets
just going to use
too
makeup gain
demanding. Now we're breaking
to
the
bring the
heat.
volume back up. Now, you have to use your ears a little bit for this. If you're consistently hitting 5 decibels, then you're probably going to be doing something like 3 to 4 decibels of makeup gain. So let's go and listen to this off and on and see if it sounds like it's the same volume off and on. So off.
So for weeks we can
And
be
on.
so discreet until your life gets too
So we're getting a
demanding.
little extra
Now we'll
volume, and
break
part of that is definitely the soft distortion. I find that adds about 2 decibels of output as well. So I always turn my output gain over here down 2 decibels to compensate for that. Okay, so now let's listen to this off and on.
So for weeks
Off.
we can be so discreet
On.
until your life gets too demanding. Now we're breaking the heat.
That feels about the same volume to me, but at times if you look at the input meter and the output meter, you'll see that we're actually often getting a little less volume on the output, but it feels more up front now. Okay, let's listen to this in the context of the song.
So for weeks we can be so discreet until your life gets too demanding. Now we're breaking the heat.
That's better.
Been
Cool.
down, but I've never been down
Turn it
like
off.
this. I need something out of nothing, now it's something new.
So this is a great example right here. She starts this phrase fairly loud, gets a little bit quieter, and then gets a little bit louder again.
I've been down, but I've never been down like this. I need something out of nothing, now it's something new.
So all of this quieter section right here is going to get brought up by 3 decibels because it's barely getting compressed, if compressed at all. Whereas the louder section is getting compressed, 5, 6 decibels.
Been down, but I've never been down like this. I need something out of nothing, now it's something new.
So that's getting turned down a little bit, quieter section brought up, and then they're sitting a little bit more even. So you'll notice when this is off, when she gets to this phrase right here, it's getting a little bit lost.
Been down, but I've never been down like this. I need something out of nothing, now
When I turn this on, listen to that same phrase.
I've been down, but I've never been down like this. I need something out of nothing, now it's something new.
Now, I might also do a little bit of automation after the fact to bring it up a little bit extra, but in general, now that phrase is sitting much more consistently. I might not end up having to automate it at all. I always wait to do any automation till the final step just to really hear how it's all sounding once it's all together. But this is the first approach. So a quick overview. This is 1176 style compression. It's a little bit more aggressive. It's much, much faster. The way you set this up is the studio FET or the vintage FET, auto gain off, auto release off, your release around 50 milliseconds, your attack time around 1 millisecond, your ratio around 4:1. You can go lighter if you want it to sound a little less aggressive. You can go higher if you want it to be more aggressive. And then you just dial in your threshold and your makeup gain to get the amount of compression that you want, where it's compressing on louder words and not necessarily on quieter words, or very little on quieter words, and then makeup gain so that you're not losing any volume. And then a little bit of soft distortion if it works on the vocal. I find it often does. And then your output gain down -2 just to offset the added gain from that distortion. Okay, so that's 1176 style compression. It's great on a lot of vocals. I think it sounds great on this vocal in this song. But let's jump over to another song that's a little bit lighter, and we're going to look at LA2A optical style compression. Okay, so this song, the vocals are a little bit lighter, so they really call for a lighter compression. And in this case, we're using an optical style compression, an LA2A style compressor, which basically means that it's going to react a little bit differently depending on how hard the vocals hit it. Now, we can't perfectly emulate that with the stock Logic compressor, but we can get pretty close. So the settings for this are the vintage opto setting. We set at an attack time of around 10 milliseconds. We use the auto release function here, so it kind of changes depending on how it's compressing, how hard it's compressing. We have auto gain off always. And then we are using a lighter 2-to-1-ish ratio. That's my go-to for this type of compression. And then we're just setting our threshold to get a little bit of compression. It's the same basic threshold and makeup gain scenario. I'm still using the soft distortion here and then a little bit of the output gain being turned down to balance that out. And this is what it sounds like on this vocal here.
Looking for another crisis. Looking for a comfortable rate.
If we go to that phrase right there, if I turn this compressor off,
looking for a comfortable rate.
That comfortable is a little bit loud, but the looking for is a little bit quiet. The rage, you really hear tail off at the end. When we have this compression on, you hear that rage. We hear every little breath and every little sound to his vocal right at the end of that tail.
Looking for a comfortable rate.
Right? Much, much better. And then as we get into these louder phrases here,
from this life way
it'll compress a little bit harder.
you thought would have been better by your age.
And you really hear that age trail off because it's not getting compressed at all. So then this makeup gain is adding to the volume of that quieter part. Okay, so that's vocal compression in a nutshell. Again, it doesn't have to be complicated. These two approaches are my go-to on just about every single vocal. The 1176 probably a little bit more. This opto a little bit less, but just because of the type of music that I'm mixing. If you're only ever working on lighter music, this opto might be the approach for you. But don't be afraid of trying that 1176 style and seeing if you like the sound of it on vocals. Sometimes that really fast compression can be more transparent on a vocal. So maybe try it out as well. Last note about compression is that you can stack these compressors. You can do the 1176 into the opto. That's very, very common. Some people go the opposite. They go opto into an 1176. Both approaches are common, and by stacking, each compressor can do a little less work. They can each bring their own sonic characteristics. So another thing that you can try out. But in most cases, personally, I find that one compressor set appropriately does the trick for me, and I only stack if I just really need to contain it a little bit extra, and I'm really just targeting specific areas. You can also just go in and use the clip gain to turn down little regions as well. I'll link to a video above here where I talked about how to use your clip gain for that purpose. But I think it's time for us to go ahead and move on to step number 5, where we're dialing in some vocal effects. One of the biggest mistakes when mixing vocals, and really just mixing in general, is adding effects way too early. You want to wait until after you set at least your EQ and compression. That way you can dial in a nice clean tone, and if you get any sort of muddiness or you feel like it starts to feel too distant, it's not feeling right, you know it's just the effects that you need to go to tweak to address it. So let's go ahead and get into it, starting with the 5 types of effects you can use when mixing vocals. The first 3 are reverbs. You have a short reverb, medium reverb, and long reverb. And within those, there's different flavors. There's plate reverbs and spring reverbs and room reverbs and hall reverbs that all sound a little bit different. They bring different tonal qualities. Then you have 2 types of delays. You have short slapback delays and then time delays. And these could be stereo, so slapping back and forth, or mono, just up the middle, or kind of like a narrow spread from the center. Now, we're going to be using a 3-step process to dial in these effects. Let's go and jump into Logic. Step 1 is to decide the type of effects that fit the feel of the mix for you. So let's go and listen to the vocal in this song and think about what type of effects, what feel feels right to you. Should it be really big and lush? Should it be kind of close and intimate? Check it out.
Calling me at 2:45. Somebody ought to call the doctor when I'm back on my feet. Sending me messages incomplete. I barely take the time to read 'cause I can follow the beat.
So to me, I want this vocal to feel really close and intimate. Right now it feels extremely close and intimate, so I want to push it back a little bit. But I want it to feel very much like I'm in the room with her. She's singing this to me. I don't want it to feel like huge and atmospheric. I want it to feel tight and intimate. So with that type of song, with that type of sound, I'm generally going to be going more towards shorter effects. So a short reverb, a short slapback delay. I'm not probably going to be doing big time delays or big medium to long reverbs that are very noticeable and really fill in the space. There's also not a lot of space in this song to fill in. The vocals are fairly fast. So you also want to keep in mind matching kind of the tempo of what's happening in the song to the timing of the effect. So if you have big long reverbs, but then you have fast rhythms pouring into those reverbs, they're just going to build up and build up more and more energy, and it's just going to get really, really cloudy really quickly. So the way that we're going to set this up is using sends. So you want to go to your send right here and just select an empty bus. And you can tell it's empty because it doesn't have some sort of title associated with it. So we're going to go to bus 3 for our first effect. And for the first effect, I want to use a reverb. So we're just going to title this Vox Verb. And we're just going to add a reverb plugin on here. And I tend to like the Space Designer for most of my vocal reverbs, but any of the reverbs will work. Just find one that you like. And we need to send from our send the actual signal. So you'll twist this knob here to increase the amount that's sending. Let's listen to this in solo just on the default setting here.
Calling me at 2:45.
So without this on at all,
somebody ought
we
to
send
call
over
the
to it.
doctor when I'm back on my feet.
I think it actually sounds very nice if we listen in the context of the mix.
Me at a quarter to three. Somebody ought to call the doctor when I'm back on.
But to me, that just is starting to make this vocal feel a little further away. So I want to keep this reverb shorter. So step 2 is to find the right sound for your effects. Now, this is where you're going to decide if you want to use, a hall or a plate or gated reverbs or springs. These are the different tonal options for the reverbs. And Fab DuPont said once, and it really opened up my mind, that it doesn't really matter too much the type of effect or the type of reverb as much as the length. So really getting the length is first and foremost, and then finding the right tone matters a lot more than getting the right tone. It doesn't really matter if you use a plate reverb if you use a long length plate reverb. So I don't really care which one you go with. If you go with a plate or a spring or whatever, just find the one that's the right tone and the right length for your song. So we're going to go into small spaces because I want this to feel close and intimate. And because I want to feel close and intimate, I tend to go for a room. So I know I like the sound of this 0.9 second recording room. So let's start with that and just listen to how different this sounds.
Calling me at a quarter to three.
If I really exaggerate it.
Somebody ought to call the doctor when I'm back on my feet.
I mean, it just sounds like she's in a real room now. It's very subtle. You don't even really notice that. If we go back to the default that we were on before, it sounds like this
Calling me at a quarter to
compared to
three.
this.
Somebody ought to call the
Very different feel, right? So this is a closer and more intimate space. So step 2 is to get the right tone, right? And adding into that, one of the advantages of using a send is we can also now EQ it to really get the tone that we want, to highlight a sound of that effect that we want in the context of our song. So in addition to setting this reverb, I'm also going to add an EQ on here so that I can tighten up the sound of this reverb just a little bit. I want to get rid of anything that could add muddiness, so I'm going to cut fairly aggressively to really thin it out. If you listen to just the reverb here, I'm cutting out any of this fullness down here. This is optional, and you need to do this to the type of song, but if you struggle with your reverb sounding muddy, high passing, cutting out that low information can just really help clean them up. And then in this case, I also don't want it to be very bright, so I'm going to cut a little bit of the high end. This is similar to the Abbey Roads reverb trick, if you've heard of that, but a little bit different. And then I want to kind of exaggerate this like telephony effect of this reverb. So somewhere around there sounds really cool to me. Okay, so without this, sounds like this, kind of full. This really thins it out. And then I want to blend this up in. Step 3 is to blend this back up in the context of the mix to get the right level. So setting your level in the context of the mix is crucial. So we're going to bring this all the way down and then bring up the volume of it using this little send knob over here.
Calling me at a quarter to three. Somebody ought to call the doctor when I'm back on my feet. Sending me messages.
If I take it away.
I barely take the time.
Very dry. Bite it back in.
I can follow the beat. Calling me at a quarter to three.
Now, it's subtle, but that's kind of the goal here, is we want this effect to blend in. It tucked the vocal a little bit back, but we want it to still feel close and intimate. Okay, so that's the first effect. We did small room reverb. Now I want to use a go-to that I always do, which is a stereo slapback delay. This is what I think of as kind of my warmth trick, and it's perfect for this type of feel because it's a very close sound. So we're going to go to a new bus here. We'll say bus 4, and I'll call this one stereo slap for slapback. And the idea of a slapback delay is it's a sound slapping off the walls and immediately coming back into your ears. Now, real quick, if you're finding this video helpful so far and you think it'll be helpful to other people, could you be sure to like it? It makes a huge difference in terms of YouTube actually showing it to other people, and I just want to help as many people as I can. Okay, let's get back into it. So for this one, I'm going to use, under delays, the stereo delay. And the idea here is that we were going to make it extremely fast. So we're going to turn off tempo sync, and I'm just going to bring this super, super fast, and then super, super fast on the right, but a little bit delayed on the right ear. So it's a little bit faster in the left than it is in the right, which will allow us to perceive a little bit of difference between the left and the right ear. So I'm going to mute this other send, and then turn up this signal so that we can now hear this slap delay as it sounds. If I take this off,
somebody ought to call the doctor
add it back on.
back on my feet.
Now right now it's a very high mix, so it's very obvious, but we're going to do two things to tuck it back a little bit. First, we're going to cut out the low and the high end frequencies, so we're just kind of making it a warmer sound, but we don't have a lot of the brightness to it. So I typically do something like 300 and 3100, somewhere in this range here, and on both the left and the right sides. And then I'm going to take this feedback knob all the way down to 0. And now with this, we have a much warmer sound. If we listen to just this effect, very warm, right? And this is a great one to really tuck in low, but it's really going to add some body and warmth to the vocal. So we'll do it in solo, but then we'll do it in the context of the mix to make sure we get the right level. But solo just so you can really hear it.
At 2:45, somebody ought to call the doctor when I'm back on my feet.
Cool. If I take it away.
Sending me messages incomplete. I barely...
It's subtle, but it really fills out and warms up that vocal quite a bit. And then in the context of the mix, finding the right spot for it.
At 2:45, somebody ought to call the doctor when I'm back on my feet.
Cool. That feels good to me. If I take away both of these effects,
Calling me at 2:45.
add them back in.
Somebody ought to call the doctor when I'm back on my feet.
So even if you're going to use big, long, lush sounds, I recommend using the stereo slapback technique just to add a little bit of warmth and thickness to the vocal to give it a little bit more width than just a mono vocal recording is going to have. So that's the second effect that I'm going to set on this vocal. And then I'm actually going to set one more effect, a third effect, which is just going to be a standard slapback. This is probably going to be the most obvious of the effects. And I'm actually going to do a couple things to bring it out in the mix, a couple of tricks that I've really come to love recently. So we're going to go down to our buses again and select bus 5. And we'll title this one just generally slapback. And for this one, we're going to go down to delay, but this time we're going to use the tape delay. Now, this is a very, very cool plugin. It's emulating a tape machine delay, which is just has a lot more character to it. And again, I want this to be very fast. So I'm going to turn off tempo sync, and I'm going to bring this back down somewhere around 60 to 100 milliseconds. So we'll dial it in the context with the vocal. So I'm going to go ahead and send, holding Option on the keyboard, click on the send knob here to send full signal. And now I just want to find the right timing.
Somebody ought to call the doctor when I'm back on my feet. Sending me messages incomplete.
Around there feels pretty good to me. So around 100.
Time to read 'cause I can follow the beat.
Cool. I like the sound of that. And then I'm going to cut out a little bit of the low end and a little bit of the high end, but not as extreme as we did on the other one. So I just want to cut into the fullness of this a little bit and then just a little bit of the sibilant frequencies. So cutting out kind of 6K and above. If you listen to just this slapback delay here, it sounds like this. So still fairly bright, and I can maybe even cut in a little bit more into the low cut. That sounds pretty cool to me. And I'm going to bring up this wet balance a little bit just so that I have as much volume as I want. So we'll go ahead and pull it all the way up to 100, and then I'll just use this send knob over here to determine the actual level of it inside the mix. So right now, because the wet is 100, that means our vocal level and our wet signal are exactly the same because we're sending 100%. But now I can use this knob to blend it back up in. But first I want to show you this spread function. So if you want a slapback delay that just has a little bit of width, so it's kind of around the vocal, not as extreme as a stereo delay that we set up, but just a little bit, this spread knob is really perfect for that. So listen as I turn this to the right.
Somebody ought to call the doctor when
pans out.
back on my feet.
In this case, I actually want this to be a very mono sounding signal, so I'm going to keep the spread at 0, but that's a cool trick that I've definitely used in a bunch of mixes, so something I wanted you to know about. Okay, let's go ahead and blend this up in the signal.
Calling me at 2:45, somebody ought to call the doctor when I'm back on my feet.
Okay, and a cool thing that we can do that I've recently come to really love on slapback delay is just pan it off a little bit. So that way we have the lead vocal center, but then we're panning off the slapback delay so it has its own space in the mix. So I'm going to just pan this until I notice it popping out a little bit separate from the vocal.
Calling me at 2:45, somebody ought to call the doctor when I'm back on my feet.
And that allows me to kind of add a little bit more volume to it. If I put it back to center,
I barely take the time to read 'cause I can follow the beat.
Pretty cool, right? So let's go and listen to that in the context of the mix.
Calling me at a quarter
Dial this up.
to 3. Somebody ought to call the doctor when I'm back on my feet. Sending me messages incomplete. I barely take the time to read 'cause I can follow the beat.
So if I take all these effects away, we have this.
Calling me at a quarter
Very dry.
to 3.
Add these in.
Somebody ought to call the doctor when I'm back on my feet.
Right?
Sending me messages incomplete.
Take 'em away.
I barely take the time to read 'cause I can follow the beat.
Now they feel like they're part of the mix and not just a vocal that's sitting on top of the mix. Now, because this is a send, I can actually go a little bit crazier. So I'm going to play around with this a little bit more, and then I want to show you what I do on the slapback in just a second. So I have the tape delay as we set it, and then I also added a distortion 2 plugin, so adding a little bit of grit if we listen to this in solo.
Calling me at a quarter.
Just a slapback here.
Somebody ought to call the doctor.
It's gridded up a little bit now, right? And then I'm using the console EQ to EQ it a little bit, add a little bit more of this 3.2, cut a little bit of the highness, add a little bit more drive over here.
Calling me at a quarter.
And then the de-esser to just catch the S's a little bit more like this.
Sending me message.
And then the space designer hitting a spring reverb that's kind of medium length, so a little bit longer to just catch the tails. And we're using a really low mix here with 100% dry. So the dry is all the way set to 0 decibels, meaning it's not turning it down at all. And then I've just blended up the wet to get a little bit of this tail. And that makes this a very cool, interesting sounding effect. So as opposed to just the standard tape delay that would sound something like this, it now sounds like this. And in the context,
sending me messages incomplete. I barely take the time to read 'cause I can follow the beat.
so that's vocal effects in Logic. Now, obviously, your song might call for something different, but it's still going to be the same 3-step process. You're going to determine what it needs, what type of effects you want. So if you want to be close and intimate and small, or you want to be big and huge and lush, you're going to pair the effects to get that type of tone that you're looking for. And then you're going to find the right sounds, and then you're going to blend them up in the context of the mix. One of the best things I ever learned about vocal effects is that effects are best felt, not heard. In a lot of cases, vocal effects, you get them up to where you notice them, and then you scale them back just a little bit, and that's probably going to be the right level in the mix. Some effects you want to be super obvious and apparent, but that's a little bit less common. Okay, it's time to get into the final step of the vocal mixing process, step number 6, automation. Automation is where we're fine-tuning. You can do anything in automation. You could automate EQs and compressors and all that stuff, but when it comes down to it, there's 2 main things that you should be focusing on with vocal automation. The first is vocal writing. This is where we're writing the volume fader to make sure it's exactly the right volume at every point and bringing out interest and character of the voice. And the second is effects, to make sure the effects are interesting and all sitting at the right level for the vocals at every different point of the song. If you don't already have it, be sure to grab the Pro Vocal checklist that just goes through the 6 steps that we're doing throughout this series and how to do them inside Logic, so the next time you're mixing vocals, you can just quickly reference back to that. It's completely free, so be sure to pick it up. But let's go and jump into Logic, and let's start by listening to a before and after of the vocal up until this point. So the vocal, without any processing, any of the stuff we've done throughout the series on it, sounds like this.
Every time say that we both agree that we've got an understanding, except that look when you leave. So for weeks we can be so discreet until your life gets too demanding. Now we're breaking the heat.
I mean, pretty big improvement, right? And with automation, we're not going to hear drastic difference. This is going to be, again, really fine-tuning it. So that's more or less the vocal sound, but now we're going to get it to sit exactly right at every moment, and we're going to do that through vocal writing and effect automation. Let's start with vocal writing, and with that, we're listening for cool character things we can bring out and making sure that no word or phrase is ever too quiet or too loud. Compression did the heavy lifting on that. It got it fairly controlled, but now we're going to use automation just to really fine tune it, make sure that every word is heard clearly and not too loud. Let's go and listen through this first half here and decide if there's anything we need to turn up or down, or if we just want to bring out more character.
Every Every time say that we both agree that we've got an understanding, except that look when you leave.
So that first line sounds great to me. There's nothing that gets lost. There's nothing that's too loud. It's a fairly sparse segment, so that makes sense. But I do want to bring out a little bit of character. There's some coolness in the way she comes into this first phrase, this first word here, and the way she leaves this word here. Let's listen to those.
Every time say that we both agree.
That gree is really airy and breathy. So I'm going to hit A on the keyboard to bring up my automation here. And you could do this by changing from read over here to touch or latch. And then you could use this volume fader to write it in manually. But we're just going to draw it in just because I want to be pretty precise on these points.
Every time say
So what I want to do is basically just have it catch a little bit extra as she's coming into that word to get kind of the coolness in her voice right there.
every time,
That breath going into it, and then the way she's hitting that every.
every time,
Let's listen to the context of the mix.
every time say that
think
we
that's
both
cool.
agree that
And then the gree, I basically just want to have it turning up as she's ending the word there.
both agree that we've got
It's a little bit extreme, so we'll scale that back a little bit, but that's the idea.
both agree that we've
It gives the listener the sense that they are right up next to the vocalist, hearing every little whisper, every little cool thing coming out of the voice. I'm just going to slide that back a little bit so that it's not getting the start of the word quite as much. Listen to that one more time.
agree that we've
Cool.
got an understanding, except that look when you leave.
That's cool with me.
For weeks we can be so discreet until your life gets too demanding. Now we're breaking the heat.
And then I want to bring up heat just a little bit in general, and then also catch the character at the end of the word. So we'll just bring up the word in general a little bit, and then I'm also just going to add an extra automation point here to bring up the tail of it just a little bit extra. Listen to that.
We're breaking the heat. I've been
back
down,
over
but
main.
I've never been down like this. I need something out of nothing, now it's something new.
Okay, so notice how as we get into the second half of that phrase right there, it's definitely a little bit too quiet. And I don't want to compress it anymore. I just want to bring it up a little bit extra in this final automation stage. So
Been down, but I've never been down like this. I need something out of
it's really somewhere around here it starts to get a little quiet. So we're just going to automate up the rest of the phrase from here on. Add one more automation point at the start of this, and then just pull this up. Let's listen to that.
down, but I've never been down like this. I need something out of nothing.
Down is a little bit loud, so what I'm going to do is just pull this down, and then I'm going to pull this next section up a little bit more.
But I've never been down like this. I need something out of nothing, now it's something new.
A little bit more, and I still think this middle part of this phrase is a little bit quiet. I'm gonna add one more point there. I'm just going to turn that up. Listen to that.
I've never been down like this. I need something out of nothing, now it's something new.
Okay, so that's vocal writing. I'm going to stop there just because I think you get the point. I would continue on with this, make sure every word throughout the entire song is really sitting right, and I'm bringing out character. I only do this on lead vocals. I might turn down backing vocals up and down here and there in sections, but it's not as minute detail oriented as it is in the lead vocal. And by the way, if you have something like the fader port or X-Touch or the UF control surfaces from SSL, any of those, you can write this in, again, by changing this from read to touch or latch, and then you can use those faders to write this in, which can be a big time saver. Okay, let's go ahead and jump over now and talk about effect automation. Now, the effects that we set up in the previous video, I think are great global effects, and they're actually the effects in the final released version of the song. I didn't have any other effects, but when I was setting up for this video, I was listening through just thinking, is there any area where it would be cool to bring in more effects that I hadn't thought about? And I realized, yes, this section that we are in right here, as it moves into it, everything kind of drops way back and the vocal stays way up front. And I think it would be really cool to try to tuck the vocal back more with some longer reverb and a time delay. So I went ahead and set up a bus 8 and bus 9 here. And bus 8 is just a longer reverb. It's about a 3-second spring reverb, and then I just did a little bit of EQ after it to shape it a little bit more. And then I also set up this tape delay here. And that's just a pretty cool sounding quarter note tape delay. EQ'd a little bit of it here, did a little bit of spread, and then did a phase tripper pedal on it just to add a little bit of phasing, which I think gives it a cool effect. And what I want to do is, as we go into this section, automate that up a little bit, and then throughout it, maybe automate up a little bit at key points to really exaggerate the effect. So let's go and listen to this transition and see kind of what I'm talking about, how it needs to be pushed back just a little bit more.
I've been down, but I never been down like this. Laid out at home, thinking about that peace.
Again, that's a part I'd continue vocal writing.
All those lies I told myself, or the eyes of someone else, no, they never really help.
I just want to push that back a little bit. So we're going to bring up the automation for this bus here. Now, a cool trick is that if you go under your mix window to auto-select automation parameter in read mode, then what this is going to do is any automation parameter that you click on, it will automatically change over to it. So if I click on this volume fader, it's going to pull up my volume fader. If I click on this knob here, it's going to change that. If I have this off, then when I click on this knob, it doesn't do anything. When I click on this volume, it doesn't do anything. This allows me to not have to go in and find that specific parameter to be able to automate it. I just click on it, and now I'm automating that parameter with this little line right here. So all I need to do now is just hold Command on the keyboard to select my marquee tool that I have set in my second position here. And then I can select that area and just drag up. And I like to do this in the context of the mix, so listening to it, find where that vocal level sits right. So we're gonna do that while listening to the music here.
There's just one place. All those lies I told myself, or the eyes of someone else, no, they never really help. All those lies I told myself, or the eyes of
That's
someone
cool.
else.
So if we take that reverb back off, it sounds like this.
All those lies I told
Add
myself,
the reverb back on.
or the eyes of someone else, no, they never really help.
Pretty cool, right? Okay, so it definitely helps tuck it back a little bit, but I want to go a step further and exaggerate up at the end of the reverb so that it's sending more as she's ending these phrases so that we hear more of it in the little gaps. Now, we can do this by exaggerating it here, and that'll be the first thing that we do, but I'm also going to pull up this reverb track and automate it up on that level as well. So if we find this reverb here, it's called verb long, and hit create track here, it will now show up over here, and I can automate this volume here to come up in the pockets when she finishes phrases. So
All those lies I told myself, or the
I'm going to turn this down just a little bit and then turn it up at this level here.
lies I told myself, or the eyes of someone
And then I
else.
just want that to end right before the next phrase. Turn it up a little bit quicker. So something like this.
Those lies I told myself, or the eyes of someone else. No,
So we're going to do the same thing. I'm going to turn up the send signal just a little bit. And then I'm also going to turn up right after she finishes that phrase, right before the next phrase. We're just going to turn this up a little bit right here. Listen to that.
or the eyes of someone else. No, they never really help.
And then I'm actually not going to do on that last part of the phrase. So that's something that might need a little bit more fine tuning to get to really sit just right, but you get the idea. You can fill in these pockets of space with effects in really cool ways. Okay, we're going to go ahead and do the last one, which is this tape delay here. So if I click on it, again, with this auto select automation parameter in read mode enabled, then it will pull up that automation lane right here. And I can just select this whole area and turn up the volume in the context of the mix until I like the level that I'm hearing at.
All those lies I told myself, or the eyes of someone else. No, they never really help. All those lies I told myself, or the eyes of someone else. No, they never really helped.
Cool. Okay, I'm digging that, and I'm also going to find that track, create it. So long delay here, we'll hit create track, and do this basically the same thing in those same pockets. Just try to bring up that delay in that space right there just a little bit extra. So I'm just going to select this gap, turn it up a little bit more.
Myself, or the eyes of someone else. No, they
So I just want to bring that someone else right there.
someone else. No, they never really helped else. No, they never really helped.
And I'll leave that last one. Okay. So without these effects, it sounds like this.
All those lies I told myself, or the eyes of someone else. No, they never really helped.
And then with those effects, it sounds like this.
All those lies I told myself, or the eyes of someone else. No, they never really helped.
Might take a little longer to get that to sound exactly the way I want it to, but it's definitely moving in the right direction. And this is the cool thing about automation and using automation with our vocal effects is we can create different spaces, different environments for different points of the song. So it's very common for me to have really dry verses that don't have a lot of effects. And you open up in the chorus and it's a big lush chorus with lots of reverb and time delays and things like that. Then you go to the next verse and it shrinks back down again. And then you go to a bridge and it gets all weird and has really obvious delays and things that are totally inappropriate for other points of the song, but because of automation, I can just bring them up at the key moments where it makes sense. So before you go, if you don't already have it, be sure to grab the Pro Vocal Checklist. It's totally free. It goes through the 6 steps that we did throughout the series. So next time you're mixing vocals, you can just quickly reference back to it. And I'd love to hear from you. Are there any other things that you typically automate on your vocals? One thing that's somewhat common for me is actually EQ, especially if there's one phrase or one section that's just a little bit muddy, but the rest of the song sounds great. I might just use an EQ that will automate down a little bit more, a little larger of a cut for one section and then go back up to where it should be for the rest of the song. That kind of stuff can make a big difference in terms of the overall song feeling exactly right at every point throughout the song. But again, just volume writing and a little bit of effect automation are my go-tos, and if you're not already doing it, definitely try them out. If this video was helpful, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you next week with another video.
One thing